Okay, I see we are live now. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us on this very important session, which is part of FIFA. And today we are on this particular session, we are looking at COVID-19 misinformation legislation in Southern Africa and its impact on freedom of expression. And also we will touch on access to information as well. So just to give a bit of introduction, we are going to look at specifically the legislation that was passed by the different countries in the Southern African region that specifically focused on fake news and what impact it had on freedom of expression and obviously on access to information, because these are related rights. So there are reports that are important landmark reports that looked at this issue in depth, and we had the State of Internet Freedom in Africa report, and also MISA worked on on reports that raised similar issues. So basically, the aim of this session is to reflect on the experiences of the different countries in the Southern African region, and from the dimension of freedom of expression, and also from access to information. We will consider the views, advocacy views, but we will also consider, we have a professor in the house, so we'll look at the academic perspective. So to introduce myself, my name is Hlengi Wedube. I am based with the Center for Human Rights, which is an academic and NGO institution, which is at the University of Pretoria Center for Human Rights. And we focus on different human rights issues, but my area of focus is expression, information, and digital rights unit, and I'll be moderating the session. So we have very experienced speakers among us who are going to help us unpack this topic of today, and I will introduce them. I will start off with Nashilongo. And Nashilongo is a digital policy researcher. She's a media and communications specialist. And we are looking at a woman here who is a founder and director of Namshue Digital. This is a new initiative, and I guess we'll learn more about it. And it's a research and design initiative which focuses on technology, media, and communication intersections. She is also the founding president of the Internet Society, which is the Namibian chapter, and is now also an advisor to the Namibia National Working Group on Internet governance. And she's currently an Open Internet Leadership Fellow for 2020-2021. Thank you, Nashilongo, for joining us on this session. And our next speaker is Ngaba Machazi. Ngaba is with Media Institute of Southern Africa, the Zimbabwean chapter, and he is the regional campaigns coordinator and is responsible for organizations for MISA's regional footprint and also strengthening networking. And I'm sure he is also doing the same by being on this platform as well. And he has quite an extensive experience in media and journalism and media rights advocacy, and he's a qualified journalist who has worked for Alpha Media Holdings in Zimbabwe, which is a private newspaper. And he holds a master's degree in media practice for development, and also he was an editor when he was with the Alpha Media Holdings. Welcome, Ngaba, and thank you. And now we move on to Daniel O'Malley, who is the Deputy Editor and Digital Policy Specialist with the Center for International Media Assistance at the National Endowment for Democracy. I'm sure we have heard this name a lot. Now we meet one of the colleagues from that organization. And he conducts research on changes in the global media environment, and also his policy portfolio includes internet governance and implications of new digital media technologies on the media systems. Welcome, Daniel. And we have a professor in the house, and Professor Admire Murray. Professor Admire Murray she's an associate professor at the Department of Communication. It's the Namibia University of Science and Technology based in Windhoek. And he's also a research associate with the University of Johannesburg. And he specializes in the intersection between technology and society, digital journalism, social media politics, media and democracy. And he has also participated in other research projects such as the social media misinformation, elections, and focusing on Zimbabwe and Kenya. And he's also co-edited works on participatory journalism in Africa, and also co-editor of media conflict and peace building in Africa. So he comes into this conversation with a wealth of experience in this particular area. So that was just to give you a brief background of the authors that we have, of the speakers that we have in the house today as we tackle misinformation legislations in Southern Africa. So so when we are looking at this area, this issue of COVID-19, the pandemic that hits the world, and we saw governments responding in different ways, including coming up with laws that specifically focused on fake news. Mind you, I'm saying fake news in quotation marks. And this particular area of fake news and these legislations that were then developed, in your view, Nashilongo, what was the impact, or what continues to be the impact in the area of what's your take in the area of freedom of expression? And also you can touch on access to information. I don't want us to leave behind access to information.
Yes. Thank you, Lengiwe, and I'm grateful to be here today, and is joined by these colleagues who are very widely knowledgeable in this issue. It's a very funny way to respond to this question, and I think that is the aspect that we look at COVID all in general, right? Like possibly everybody find themselves in this situation and didn't know what to do, and everybody just tried to do what they could. So specifically to speak on these legislations aiming at arresting misinformation during COVID, for the Southern African region, and I'm sure this applies to most of the Africa region, is that we have seen so many of these legislations being being put in place by a number of governments. If I have to speak specifically for Namibia, I can't remember of any consultation that has happened with the media industry or with stakeholders whatsoever in making sure that these legislations are in place, and yeah, for lack of better word, just for consultation, especially with the media industry, but also with public to a certain extent. And I think this is also what happened in most of African countries, lack of consultation. And obviously that has resulted in a number of issues, and issues that we know, for instance, that, people were jailed, or they come with, these heavy fines that were quite frightening, I'm sure, for the media, not to be engaging, to bear off, or to try and put away the media or even the public from engaging in so-called information that is not verified or is not coming from a central point from a government. And what happens is that that has put the journalists and media not to be reporting. So a lot of restriction in terms of content creation or covering the pandemic all in all. But obviously there's also a lot of other things that has happened because of COVID that could not be related directly to this legislation. But obviously the legislation themselves meant that restrictions of what to be covered and what not to be covered on by the media, and in the broader thick of things, that means controlling government content, so to say. Yeah, Klengiwe, let me end there and let my colleagues build on or add their
So yes, I hear you, Nashilongo, but if you're looking at these laws, Prof. Admire, did they result in actually controlling the spread of misinformation or disinformation? What impact do they have?
Thank you, Klingiwe, and also thank you to Nashilongo. I also want to thank everyone on the panel. I want to just start by saying that certainly I think we've seen that laws generally cannot curb the spread of misinformation, disinformation, or malinformation. That's unfortunate that in as much as we continue to talk about that laws are not the panacea to dealing with these things. I think what we really need probably is to revisit our communication landscape, making sure that the platform companies are probably held accountable in terms of what kind of content can actually navigate or flow from their own platforms. That is very important. Also, we also need generally, again, to make sure that we educate the ordinary people in terms of media literacy or critical media literacy skills, so that they can know what is fake and what is not. And I think that really, I don't think in any context, I don't think the laws themselves would be able to curb the spread of misinformation. What actually we saw happening actually in most Southern African countries was that we ended up with a situation where ordinary people were just being harassed or being arrested for so-called spreading misinformation. But when you look at it, whether there was intention, how do you measure the intention to spread? And I think that's where the problem that I have with the law. How do you measure the intent to spread misinformation? Or how do you say somebody got it from somebody and then unknowingly or without verifying, then send it to the next person, and that person is the person that gets arrested? Where do we draw the line between the intent or the person who actually originates the actual fake news and the person who just gets into the bandwagon of actually sharing this thing? And I think that's the problem that we ended up. And I know that in Namibia here, with people that were arrested and then they were fined something like 2,000 Namibian dollars. We also had similar cases in Zimbabwe where people were arrested, and unfortunately, people's rights were being violated in the name of these so-called statutory instruments. In other countries, they came through national emergency measures. Some they came through national disaster, pronouncements by the president. But there, as Nashilongo has pointed out, there was little consultation. There was also little of even parliamentary input in terms of this. So it was pretty much coming from presidents most of the time. So it was a presidential kind of a decree that just came into being just because they were dealing with a crisis, and all of a sudden, then that became almost like law. And unfortunately, some of these laws, in as much as we don't really like them to be there, they are likely to be with us beyond COVID. And that's the unfortunate part, because in most countries, often these laws are actually used to constrain and also to restrict freedom of expression and even access to information. I'll stop there so that others can come in.
Yes, thank you so much, Admire. You are raising issues around the complexities of these laws and how difficult it is actually to implement them and also to interpret them. I'll come back to the laws, but I want to go to Daniel now. If we're looking at this, also this fake news laws, from the work that we have been doing, Daniel, what has been CIMA's analysis of these laws, like with relation to freedom of expression and access to information?
Great, yeah, thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be with you all today. I think it's a really good question. I would, echo what the professor has just told us, that we don't see that these types of laws really have the impact that they're stated to have, which also begs the question of, what is the intended actions of these laws? If they're titled disinformation laws, is that really the motivation behind them? I think that the work we've done at CIMA, which is for a media development think tank, we work globally, and we're really looking at, this disinformation problem from actually a very different perspective than the governments that are passing these laws. That's for sure. And one of the things that we think is that, trying to regulate from a government level what's accurate or what's not, what's fake news, what's not, that's a really hard question, and probably one that's better in most cases for governments not to get too involved with. What we really need is to strengthen the media ecosystem so that we have really strong news outlets, so that citizens have access to high quality information. Another kind of corollary to this issue of fake news laws is internet shutdowns. Oftentimes governments will justify an internet shutdown because they say that it's fake news is spreading on the internet. Essentially means that some type of information that they're not happy with is spreading on the internet. It doesn't, what we know from internet shutdowns, and actually from the great work that CPEZA has done on the cost, including the cost to, they've done great research on the cost of the economy. One of my friends at CPEZA, Juliet Nanfuka, has done research on how social media taxes actually inhibit kind of the process of journalism in a country. So all of these kind of tactics that are aimed at supposedly improving the quality of information online actually have the opposite impact, is I would say what we see. And so what we really need to think about is how do we strengthen the vibrancy, pluralism of the media ecosystem, including the digital media ecosystem, instead of trying to slap on these band-aids that are totally ineffective, often created with the wrong intentions potentially.
Yes, thank you so much, Daniel, for your responses to that question. I now want to move to Nava, where you work from, Mr. Zimbabwe. You worked on this report on the state of press freedom in Southern Africa. So just give us a bit of background into this report before I come back to you with a question. Just give us a brief background to this report. Thank you.
Okay, maybe just to take it from how we started. A few years ago, we used to have a report called So This Is Democracy, and I think it's no longer in publication. That's good that Nashilongo was one of our editors on the state of press freedom in Southern Africa report. I think she can say more, but generally what we were trying to see is to have sort of evidence-based lobby and advocacy, because most of the time we are just shooting from saying people have been arrested, but we are not documenting it. Media violations have happened, but we're not documenting it. And we try to have it to be holistic, covering all sorts of sectors from digital rights to gender and the media, and also country reports in terms of, like I said, country reports on digital rights, country reports on media violations. And we documented all the violations that happened. So it was our first report. I think it has been well received, and we hope to do another one next year, which we're going to launch on World Press Freedom Day. So it's just to measure where we are in terms of media freedoms in Southern Africa, the country. We don't have ratings yet, but then we can use this year's report to compare to last year's to see if there's been an improvement or things have become worse.
That's the background, at least that I needed, so that we come back and ask the specific question. So in your assessment, you obviously looked at these laws that we are talking about now, and some of these laws imposed punitive fines and also jail terms. What is your comment on these punitive measures that were imposed in these laws? Would you say this was a nail in the coffin for press freedom? You have been a journalist, you are a media person. What is your view on this position?
I want to start with what Admire said towards the end of his presentation. You said most of those laws are not going to be repealed. They are with us forever, well, in some countries. So the impact is, it's a serious death knell on media freedom in Southern Africa. If you look at a country like Tanzania, I think it's got one of the most draconian, if I can use that word, it's got one of the most draconian laws when it comes to fake news and COVID. And the irony is that for a long time, Tanzania didn't even recognize that there was COVID. But if you write anything about COVID, you were most likely going to lose your license, be suspended for 6 months. So it's a long road to have these laws repealed. One of the questions that we have asked of governments in Southern Africa is to say, can you give us a timeline of when you're going to repeal these COVID-19 fake news laws? Because as they are, and not to sound pessimistic, and my fear is that they'll continue for a while to come, they'll be used to stifle press and media freedom. If you look at Zimbabwe, I think is one of the most notorious countries in terms of that. We have so many laws that outlaw fake news or publishing falsehoods. Why they needed an extra law in terms of COVID, I don't understand. To make matters worse, some media practitioners have gone to court and challenged the laws that make it illegal to publish false news, and they won in court at the Constitutional Court. But somehow our government finds a way of resuscitating these laws. So in this way, you feel as if there's a sinister agenda in countries like particularly Zimbabwe and Tanzania, where they don't want to be seen to be controlling the media, but they use such laws to control the media. And a problem with Zimbabwe, I'll speak a lot about Zimbabwe, is because such laws are strict liability. Instead of the court proving that you intended to publish falsehoods, the onus is on you to say, no, look, it was a mistake. So the court doesn't have to prove, the prosecution rather, doesn't have to prove that you intended to spread falsehoods. You have to prove that you were not trying to spread a falsehood, which is a bizarre case, because generally in law, and I'm not a lawyer by any chance, generally in law you have to prove that, the court has to prove that you are guilty rather than you proving that you are innocent. So I think it's a long road. It's a slippery slope. And we have to continue demanding that governments repeal these laws, because as it is, most of the regulations that have to do with COVID have been lifted in most countries in Southern Africa. They are level 1s or level 2s, whatever we are in terms of these things, but nothing has changed in terms of the publication of falsehoods. So as long as it remains like that, as long as you don't make noise about it, government is going to relax and say, we've got this, and they'll continue using such laws to clamp down on freedom of expression.
Indeed, Prof. Maya said we would really love to have these laws be repealed at some point. I don't think there's any justification of continuing beyond COVID-19 with these laws. And we also welcome comments from our participants and questions in the chat section. Please feel free to ask questions and comments. And now back to these laws, Nashilongo. These laws have been said to be vague, overly broad, repressive, and that obviously has an impact on media freedom or press freedom. What is that impact?
Yeah, thank you again, Hlengiwe. So what happens is that obviously the impact has been like what my colleague Ngaba was saying, that for as long as they stay, it restricts what the media covers or what has not covered. For instance, and I'll speak for, from a Namibian's perspective, we're not seeing as much the media questioning about how much money is government, for instance, spending in the COVID situation. Who are the people being awarded tenders? Like that kind of information then, because of the presence of the law and because obviously of the novelty of this pandemic, journalists aren't able to get to do their work. So what has the media been limited to is to be reporting on the cases. What is being, how many cases are being reported every day, the death cases, do we have the vaccines in the country? But there's so much information that related to COVID that we're not hearing or that we're not consuming as media consumers, and I'm sure this is everywhere else. I mean, for instance, we've had cases in Zimbabwe, and this is also what this report, especially the Mr. Zimbabwe report, is saying, is that journalists went I think it was Hopewell Chinono, and that's a very common case within the Southern African region. And he had just asked or published information that was asking about, funds that are supposedly put away or to deal with COVID, and revealing that kind of information. And so there's been, this law then restricts the extent of what the journalists, how far the journalists can go with regards to COVID and what COVID regulations has been. So the public obviously is then forced to consume very, very basic information about COVID, and because that is what possibly the law is trying to promote, that consume whatever that information that is given to you by a certain public institution or public officials, and you only consume or you cover or you publish what is there. Obviously, also because of the pandemic, I'm sure journalists aren't getting as much information to dig deeper and publish and get the public to decide for themselves as to what other content or what other alternatives are there. The long-term effect, I think, are those ones, as Prof. Mare and Ngaba have said, that for as long as those laws are in place, the determination of what the media content will be is purely decided by that media houses and journalists have to think twice. Do I have to go to prison for 5 years? I think that was the case of Malawi and Botswana. Must I go to prison for 5 years, or for this specific information that I'm about to publish, or pay $100,000, or is it $10,000 US? And with the media content and advertisers being extremely vanished in the past few years, somebody has to think twice about that. That could be salaries for a number of journalists for over a month. So for as long as those laws are there and they impose those fines and they impose those restrictions, media houses and journalists have to censoring themselves as to what do I cover and when do I cover.
Thanks, Nashilongo, for raising those issues. Allow me to just throw the same question to Daniel about these laws that are broad, repressive, and vague, and their impact, especially when you're looking at access to information and or press freedom. From the work that we've done with CIMA, you go beyond, you cover many countries beyond Southern Africa, and in your would appreciate even if you bring examples from beyond Southern Africa.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a really great question. And I think that, one of the things that we've seen reverberate globally, and not just in the African context, is this issue that Nashilongo picked up on, which is a lot of the impetus behind this legislation is what governments want to be able to control the narrative. And so we've seen laws around, basically it's this fake news laws, but it's basically saying if it's not the government published information, it's by default fake. So, I was speaking with a researcher in Sri Lanka who was saying that this was really an issue because, they have these kind of fake news laws that outlaw publishing of kind of alternative data that isn't from the government. But then there's just serious questions about the capacity of the government in that context to actually produce, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. Every government was trying to, get testing up and get numbers out. So journalists were doing their best, triangulating to figure out what the actual numbers were. But then there were these policies, government policies that were saying, well, but you can't do that because that would be fake news or unverified, state-supported information. So it just raises this question, if these are actually about, elevating high quality information, wouldn't you want it to be information that's more accurate? And some of these laws seem to be just suggesting that the motivation isn't around the accuracy of the law, it's that the information has the same narrative as what the government is saying about a situation. I think that's the Tanzania case is another one that we already came up, right? A country that said that they didn't have COVID, but even though that was obviously false, now is passing these legislation and even punishing news outlets for talking on that. I mean, it is kind of an ironic and tragicomic situation, actually. The other thing I wanted to say, and it's related, is, and SEMA, we've been doing work on it, but there's other great organizations who've been tracking this. And, one of them is Global Partners Digital has this great disinformation tracker where you can look at what kind of different laws are on the books and how they've actually been implemented. And, the one of the things that the disinformation tracker folks at GPD have said is, it's not proportional, a lot of the actions that governments are taking. And that's playing into the chilling effect. So in Tanzania, we have a case where, supposedly some fake news was spread. Supposedly it's, so whatever, I'm not even going to get into whether that's true or not, but like that was the law that was used. And then the consequence was to, a news outlet had to stop publishing for 6 months. Well, that in no way is a response to the underlying issue. It's not proportional whatsoever. And so that's the kind of chilling effect of these types of laws that Dashilongo was talking about. If you're a news outlet who, COVID also posed a lot of challenges in terms of funding and being able to survive and being able to do reporting in an environment where you can't send reporters out, right? This is just one more thing that really is a weight on independent media, I think, especially in Southern Africa, but we see this around the world. I hear what people are saying, that these are probably around. I do want to also be optimistic, and maybe later on we can talk about how do we, if we are all in agreement, these are kind of a very bad path. What are the kind of things that stakeholders can do regionally or globally to try and counteract this negative trend?
So I now want us to move over to something else. Still on the content of these laws, you realize that they made the political office bearers and also government institutions or public institutions as the bearers of truth. Like they are the ones that were holding the truth, like had the credible truth, credible information, or credible anything else was something else. So how did that impact on press freedom or diversity of sources, or just your comments around that issue, Professor Admire?
All right, thank you, Hlengiwe. So one thing that I observed generally, which happened in in fact most African countries, was that there was a centralization, if you have to say, of communication during the height of COVID-19. So everything was pretty much being done by government. And because it was being done by government, as I have pointed out, it meant that even the free flow of information was also not guaranteed, because the government would determine what gets published ultimately, or what gets communicated through press conferences or through those so-called press releases that were being done by ministers of health, and also sometimes by the president himself or herself. So with that centralization of communication and information dissemination, we had a situation where it became very difficult even for ordinary people themselves to get to understand, because especially in a context where trust in government is very low, chances are that people may not take what is actually being published by these ministries or by government officials as truth. And actually, that's where you see, if you look at the type of misinformation and disinformation that was being circulated, it centered around those figures, etc. It centered around the untruth that public officials were disseminating. It centered around the envisaged or pre-planned lockdowns that these people were going to roll out. So you had memes and other things and conspiracy theories that were centering around this kind of centralization that had come into play. And once you centralize, the problem that once you centralize communication, especially in a context where we already have got multiple communication platforms, like you've got digital, you've got traditional, the chances are that you cannot then be able to control the narrative, because people also have to use their other alternative platforms to communicate or to circulate whatever is happening in that kind of space. So that's what we saw, especially in Southern Africa. So you had a lot of press release journalism, because again, journalists were also not being given the opportunity to go around the country, looking for stories, doing field work as they usually do. So they relied more on government sources to just give them. So you rely on press releases. How do you then verify whether what is written on the press? Because in journalism, what we say is that press release is just a raw material. It's pretty much the starting point of a story. It's not the end of the story. But what you ended up seeing in most African countries was that the press release became their story and the end and the start of the story. And I think that also created a problem. So that's also why I was raising that the problem with some of these laws is that they also criminalize journalism, but they also make it very difficult to have access to information, and also the free flow of information is also affected by these kinds of laws. So going forward, again, as we have already pointed out, I think there's need to have concerted campaigns, I think regional campaigns around the repealing of these laws. Otherwise, if we don't do that, chances are that they are going to be used for elections. And I think the next port of call is usually elections. That's where you are likely to see these elections being used, because that's where, again, where you tend to see a lot of fake news actually being circulated. That's what I would say for now. Thanks, King.
Machas, you are the experienced journalist in this conversation. The bearers of the truth being the politicians and the public offices, how does that affect a media house or a journalist, the work of a journalist?
Okay, I understood I think Daniel touched on it, and Nashilongo, about the question that you asked them earlier. What this does, these legislations, before I get to your question, they foster a culture of self-censorship, where if the government hasn't said something, then it's not true. And I think every government, probably most governments in Southern Africa, they love a situation where they are the owners of the truth, where anyone who says anything else is a liar. I think they love that more than anything else. So what you find is that this has a chilling effect on investigative journalism. You are stuck to writing stories about he said, she said, in a statement, the government said, and it becomes, the journalism becomes very banal, it becomes boring, and really it's the end of journalism as it is, because you cannot be relying on government for the truth. As journalists, we like to call ourselves the fourth estate, the watchdogs, but what kind of a watchdog are you when you're just repeating what the government said? You're just playing fetch. You're no longer a watchdog, you're just going to catch the ball that the government has thrown at you. So really, we are in a rut right now. Unfortunately, our journalism in most of Southern Africa is not where it's supposed to be, really. And when you throw such a curveball with such legislations, we just get worse. Newsrooms are shrinking, newsrooms are smaller, advertising revenue is down. You're competing with social media, which is real time. Newspapers here, particularly in Zimbabwe, literally the reporting yesterday's news, because we know everything that's happened via social media. So already the media industry is already in a fix because of all these pressures that it's facing. Then you have them being reduced to government mouthpieces, and what's going to happen? Sales are going to go down, advertising will continue going down, and literally that's the end of investigative journalism, particularly in countries like Zimbabwe, Tanzania. Tanzania is a very terrible example because of the laws that are there, but also in countries like Lesotho, in countries like Eswatini, you find that the journalism already there is not of top quality. They have no resources. They are facing so many problems, and then they are now government mouthpieces. So as it is really our biggest hope, not that I'm campaigning for journalists here, but not-for-profit journalism will be the only way out for journalists right now, if things stay consistent, because they are the ones who might be willing to put the government on spot. But for the rest of media, we're now just being reduced to reporting what government said, and that's not doing us any favors.
All right, now it was important really to hear from somebody who's experienced in journalism, and indeed We do not expect journalists or to be mouthpieces of the government. We expect a diversity of sources. We expect a diversity of views. We expect media houses to operate freely, and also, most importantly, to conduct investigative journalism. And if you're looking at the COVID situation, there's a lot that was going on, and we really needed journalists to unearth a lot of issues that were happening around that area. And now, if you put a fence around what is supposed to be the truth and who is supposed to tell that truth, that obviously brings problems. And again, in these regulations, there was a failure in some instances to recognize the media as an essential service. Nashilongo, why was it important to recognize the media as an essential service?
Thank you. Yes. Sorry, I've got somebody coming into my meeting, but they're gone now. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, in the media, like Ngaba, my colleague has referred to, has been well, at least in many democratic spaces, is referred to as the fourth estate, like a fourth arm of governance, other than, you know, your legislations and the judiciaries and the others. And so it was very important that the role of the media reinforced by that recognition. By doing so, helps facilitates the information again from the public to the policymakers or the information holders at this case, and really make sure that the public have all the information that they need to make sure they protect themselves. They undertake, you know, the right decisions in dealing with the pandemic. They would know what decisions to make, whether they should send their kids to school or not. Like, I mean, that is the role of the media. That's what we know about the media, really, to give us as much information, or the public as much information as they can, so that they can make informed decisions. So there was that need. But what we saw, especially in that report from Mr. Zimbabwe, is that in many of the cases that the media were not recognized as such. So the restrictions that were in place applied to them. The curfew, for instance, you know, if, you know, 6 o'clock, everybody has to be done, but journalists have to work. Most of the newspapers, for instance, goes to bed very late because of the information that has to come. So what we found, that I think one of the countries was Angola, I can't remember, and many others, that these there was not that recognition. But out of the recognition, there were also other things. For instance, you know, in the cases where you know, the openings were still there, for instance, for media releases and media and press releases. There were no measures to protect journalists, for instance. They were not, you know, given, you know, the right stuff to protect themselves. You know, the doctors, for instance, were, you know, had those gears that they must wear when they go into a ward. But journalists, in many of the cases, also were required to be reporting about the specific circumstances, maybe required to go into a hospital so that they're able to tell the stories, but they didn't have the right gears, the right protective clothes to protect themselves. So it was necessary. It was necessary that obviously that the journalists and the media needed to be recognized as, so, you know, as their roles, to make sure that the public has the right information, but also that they are able to report from all aspects. I've read, I think, in one of the reports in one of the countries from this report that we are interrogating from Mr. Zimbabwe, that you know, possibly because of dealing with controlling the crowd and the attendance of the media and press conferences, that some of the media houses ended up not being part of those ones that are invited So then these press conferences were restricted only also to only a very few media houses. That also then means that there was some sort of control, whether knowingly or unknowingly, intended or unintended, as to who gets to be reporting on specific issues. So yeah, it other than just the recognition, there is also a lot of other aspects that affected journalists in their coverage, and that speaks to issues of access to information all in all. Yeah.
So yes, indeed, it was essential for the media to be classified as an essential service during that time, as you break it down into the kind of roles that they were supposed to play and the implications of leaving them behind as well, because there was these lockdowns and there are the times where, journalists are supposed to work. You can't really prescribe the times or control them in that manner, and also the issue of protective clothing that you are stating. And we lost really a number of journalists working on the line of duty during this time of the pandemic, which is really unfortunate. But Ngaba, when you look at the situation in Zimbabwe, after, it was this proclamation of the media as an essential service, later came on as kind of an afterthought, but still after this position was taken, there were, intimidation of the media, arrest and all that. Could you just paint a picture of the situation in Zimbabwe? I know MISA was working on collecting information on this issue.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Like we had said together with Admire earlier, that these laws, it's going to be a long road to repeal them. I'm not being a cynic here, but I think the government has always wanted to deal with journalists, but they didn't have an excuse. So last year gave them the perfect excuse to say, finally, we've got them. And they literally unleashed the police and everyone on journalists. It was some of the strangest incidences were happening. The government spokesperson would go on news saying, no, journalists are an essential service, let them go ahead and do their duties. And the following day, the police arresting one journalist. You call the police spokesperson, I'm a journalist, I've been arrested. The police spokesperson says, tell them to let you free. You go to the police officer, he says, hey, I'm just doing my job. If you want, you can go to the spokesperson. So last year was really a bad year for Zimbabwe. I think in total, we recorded about 52 cases rather, of journalists where their rights were violated, were either arrested, detained, or assaulted by the police or other arms of state security. It was, for example, someone will have a press conference and police will come and arrest journalists. But then you say, but we're essential service and we've got these cards that we've been given to us, accreditation cards, but the government will not, the police rather, well, the government too, will not listen to that, and instead will go ahead and detain the journalist. She spoke about the case of Opel Chingono and Duduzi Matutu. They wrote extensively about corruption in the procurement of COVID-19 equipment. And this is why I'm saying, I'm not being a cynic, but this is why I'm saying the government was looking for an excuse to deal with journalists. They wrote about this, and then at the end of July last year, an opposition party planned protests. The government arrested Opel, and Duduzi was forced to flee the country on the guise of that these guys were promoting anarchy or something like that, and they were the ones who were leading the violence. So they've always needed an excuse to deal with journalists, but then the eyes of the world and even of us civil society have always been on the government and trying to keep them on their toes. So with these new legislations with COVID-19, government has, for the first time, really say to themselves, the Zimbabwean government at least, they say to themselves, we've now got these people where we want. It extends to every, not that I'll go into this in detail, but it extends to every aspect of our life right now in Zimbabwe. We can't have elections because the government says we are dealing with COVID-19. The opposition parties can't have meetings because the government says these are super spreader events. But the government's meetings are going on, the government's rallies are going on, but everyone else is being told, nope, we are under COVID-19 regulations. So this legislation, the COVID-19, is a godsend for our government. Even speaking about the earlier question that you asked me, where they are now the only sources of news, this is really good for them. They have never had it this easy and they're enjoying it. Instead of wanting COVID to end, they wanted to continue because they've never had it this easy. The media is in a spot, they can't write anything. Like as I said earlier, investigative journalism is on its last legs because of the situation in Zimbabwe. So the government has finally got the media where it wanted it, where the media is uncritical, where the few critical voices are silenced, where legislation like fake news legislation is used to arrest the journalists that, or not just journalists, but of the vocal people. You just throw them the book and say, this is fake news, and you're slipping in the slammer. So yeah, it's I think it's a very difficult period for journalists at the moment.
It was indeed a difficult period as we saw the situation playing out in Zimbabwe. But do we have, was it the same thing in other African countries, or Zimbabwe was just an island in this? Admire, do you have any idea of the experiences in other countries?
Thanks, Lengi. I don't know, maybe I wanted Daniel to have a say, because I think it's been quiet for some time. Maybe before I come in, maybe if it's possible, or I can go. Is that possible?
It's okay. He can go for it, and then you can.
All right.
You can respond.
All right. Daniel, over to you.
Oh, yeah. I actually am not the person who's best placed to answer this type of question about the. I think that, from my understanding, there are certain countries where the situation has been worse than others, right? I mean, we are seeing a trend throughout sub-Saharan Africa of an implementation, or sometimes just a use of a law of this nature that already exists, but applying it within the COVID context, or specific laws that have been developed with COVID in mind, or as an excuse. But I think there are certain countries that seem to be using it more frequently. I mean, I think the situation in Zimbabwe is very, very challenging. I think the situation in Tanzania is very, very challenging. But you have other, countries. I think, one thing to think about, to broaden the framing, another way to think about it is, a lot of these policies there's a broader trend in threats to internet freedom globally. We are seeing a rising tide of kind of digital authoritarianism, whether that's surveillance, which I know is going to be the topic of the CIPEZ's State of the Internet Freedom in Africa, right? So surveillance is a big issue. It's one we've released a report on just a month ago at SEMA. And so these laws are part of a broader trend that we're seeing now. It doesn't mean that you're either digital authoritarian or you're, supportive of digital rights. But what happens is, even in countries that aren't authoritarian, they're democratic, sometimes these tendencies, because we've seen policies in countries that are, faring much better, even in South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia, we've seen instances of these types of policies too. So it's not I don't want to, the good guys are the bad guys. It's this broader trend in the digital space that governments are dealing with. Even democratic governments are sometimes overstepping their bounds, taking policy actions that have negative impacts in terms of press freedom. One of the things that's important to remember is, why is the press an essential service? And, because societies need that information to make good decisions. And if we have just one narrative of truth that comes from the government, it actually does a disservice to the government, because they're not going to be able to understand what's happening in society. So I think we need to make that case also to governments around why, yes, it can be challenging to have a watchdog over your back and looking at accountability, but in the long term, it's much better for the health of society. So I'll just, with those kind of thoughts, I'll pass it back to Admire. I'm curious to hear what your take is on kind of the situation in Southern Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, and also I really want to get at what can we do about it? Because I think we are all very much in the this is horrible. It seems pessimistic. Are we going to be able to change these laws? I'm curious to know what your take is, being much better placed than I am to answer that question.
All right, thanks, Daniel, for that. Very interesting. So, to go back to what I think I was saying, was Zimbabwe and Ireland in this in this Southern African context, or within the African context? Certainly not. And I think Daniel was actually raising these issues to say it doesn't matter whether you are a dictatorial regime or you have got a democratic regime. What we have seen is that there's a lot of policy laundering that goes on in these countries. So this country gets to see that this particular country has passed this law, and then they feel like, there are these interesting aspects about it. They take it and try and domesticate it, and then they use it for their own ends. And pretty much that's what we've been seeing. Similarly, the same issue can also be said about internet shutdown that we've seen. It's countries that are learning from each other, and it's pretty much the same. And that's why we're saying, even in terms of actually dealing and making sure that we fight for the repealing of this, it would require a coordinated effort. That's what I think. Any kind of action to say this particular organization or this particular country is going to deal with its own problems and this one is going to do, I don't think it's going to work, especially with this kind of situation where we find ourselves. Because if politicians or if governments at their own level, they coordinate and they can learn from each other, why not civil society also learning from each other and then try and work together to find ways in making sure that you push back against some of these draconian laws that we are seeing. Unfortunately, as we have already pointed out, these laws don't work in terms of actually pushing back against the spread of fake news. They are not working. They are not working at all. But what they are just being used for is to punish a few individuals, just to demonstrate that the government can actually come hard on you if you do that. But at the end of the day, if you look at it, still the spread of fake news or malinformation or misinformation continues unabated. So yes, it may seem as if we're all pessimistic because we know the context in which we are operating. But I think what is really required is really to have a regional strategy. And I think I'm happy that at least Mr. now we've got a regional office now. So at least there's some kind of space where they can actually coordinate these kinds of campaigns to say what needs to be done and how do we incentivize governments to repeal these kinds of things. Because ultimately it's about incentivizing them to see that there's need to actually allow for the free flow of information, but freedom of expression to thrive, but also for them to understand that actually you can actually deal with fake news outside of the realm of legislation. And I think that is where, and I think I also like what Daniel was saying, that we need to invest a lot in building and strengthening the media system that we have. So opening up the space of, for example, in Zimbabwe, where until now, radio sector was pretty much a privilege of a few. Television, the same privilege of the few. So opening up those spaces so that you have got a diverse set of views, a diverse set of platforms, so that people can actually get information. That can actually then push back against the spread of the so-called misinformation. But if you continue to close the space, again, you open up alternative spaces where people can then have to circulate whatever they think is actually truthful when it is not truthful. So I see there's a lot that can be done, but I think, again, as I've said, we can't assume that each country is going to deal with its own problems. We also can't assume that maybe here in Namibia, because they passed this kind of law in line with the national emergency laws, it is going to just go away. I don't think it's going to go away as simple as that. Especially, I always believe that politicians always see the temptation to use some of these laws to fight opponents. And I think the political, it's like within the realm of election, that's where that kind of law can actually be of use to them. So they can actually say, instead of repealing it, why not probably just tweak it a bit to make sure that it fits whatever we want to our own motivations or our self-interest that we have. At the end of the day, politicians want to rule forever. That's the unfortunate part about politicians. So I want to leave it there for now, but I know that we can't just be pessimistic, but we also need to see other spaces of collaboration and engagement that can actually help us to push back against these things.
So yes, Ngaba, when he was responding, he said that this COVID pandemic is actually heaven sent for the politicians. They found an opportunity and they really made use of it. And yes, we are seeing that even in countries that we didn't expect it, we saw it. And I was also thinking about the issue of defamation, that we are moving towards decriminalization, but this is also this laws on fake news was also a way of bringing it back in the context of COVID-19. It's like we are derailing the gains that we had gained, especially Zimbabwe. Like for a very long time, we've been citing it as one of those countries that has made strides in this area. But when COVID hit us, things suddenly turned around. So, but looking at the lockdown now, all governments in one way or the other, except at least for Tanzania, in the context of Southern Africa, we saw the imposition of lockdowns to try and spread the pandemic and regulating activities. And Nashilongo, I want to hear from you what impact this had on the general operation of the media, the lockdown, the business of the media, be it the content creation or advertising, which we know is the lifeblood of journalism. So what was the impact of these lockdowns on the business of the media?
Thank you again. I think broadly within the region and possibly within the last 5 years, and could have been made worse by COVID, has been that media, generally the media was already streamlining. Not just, the circulation, but also, letting go a lot of their stuff. And I think in Namibia, I remember last year, one of the independent media house, the Namibian, which is really revered to in the country, has let go of 40 staff. That includes journalists, but also administrative work. And I think this trend has been anyway going on for a longer period. But also, obviously, advertising in general have also dwindled because businesses, those who used to advertise, were also affected by COVID. So what happened is that a lot of journalists that I know within Namibia and also within the region have become freelancers, have found other means of doing work. So we're looking at shortage of staff. In general, within many of the media houses, we find very, very junior journalists who are able to do the work on a very small price for the exchange of gaining the experience. So there's this term, I think a lot of my colleagues here knows, juniorization of newsrooms, where the experiences of journalists is very, very basic. So that speaks to the content that the media then covers. But COVID had a lot of other effects, like you've mentioned before. I can't remember. I think the last time I checked, there was like a tracker that was tracking the number of casualty that COVID have caused amongst journalists. I think over 50 journalists, if not so, have died as a result of COVID. But again, this is an industry that is not very incentivized. This is an industry where, journalists are not on medical aid or, for instance, have that kind of access. So there's longer effects beyond what we see. Like I've mentioned, the media houses have streamlined. For instance, I remember the bigger circulations here, the Namibian newspaper, but also the New Era, have downsized their print circulation. That obviously speaks to the cost that is involved, amongst others. But again, staffing as an issue. Many positions, even very critical positions, are now being offered on freelance basis, amongst others. So that really, I don't know how we, as an industry, how journalism or how the media landscape will function, given those many things that exist. In of course, not forgetting the legislations that are in place.
All right. Yes, indeed, it's very unfortunate that, for the media houses, they were really dealt a heavy blow, especially, and also when you're looking at freelance journalists as well that are not working under any media house. I want to find out, Ngaba, from the MISA report, what were your findings with regards the impact of the lockdowns on the media and also just the journalists in general?
Before I answer this question, can I start by going back to what Daniel and Admire said in their earlier submissions on pessimism, what we have found, or rather what we're working on is strengthening networks and collaborations. We just scored a success. I hope it works. I hope it's a success for much longer, where the Lesotho government was coming up with cybersecurity laws that are as bad as, I don't know, really terrible. Even Zimbabwe can't dream of that. So we worked a lot with organizations in Lesotho, particularly. Mr. Lesotho is very small, so we had to look for other partners, and we made lots of noise. The Parliamentary Portfolio Committee in Lesotho has now recommended that the government should not proceed with that law because it's that bad. So we see so much value in networking and collaborations. We had another case, I'm not so sure where it is, but this one is slightly older, this year though, maybe 2 months back, where we engaged the ACHPR mechanism. Mauritius was working on a cybersecurity law that was also not very good for a country that's as democratic as Mauritius. And the government has sort of stepped back in terms of proceeding with that law. So yeah, I think the more the merrier, if we work as many from different countries, because if it looks like it's just Mr. Zimbabwe but lobbying the Zimbabwean government, it looks like it's in isolation. We can deal with these guys and get over with it. But if a voice were to come from the center anywhere, if a voice would come from academia in Namibia and from SEMA and from everywhere, the governments will tend to see that there is more work being done, and this is going to put us in a bad light. Right, in terms of our report, to be honest, we did not look at the impact of COVID in terms of newsrooms, although we've got anecdotal evidence of what was happening. I know a number of newspapers in Botswana, for example, they went digital, which means cutting costs, and which means unfortunately cutting jobs. In Zimbabwe, because like particularly for the first lockdown, which is March last year, nothing was happening like economically. So also they had to, most newspapers went digital. And so for example, you're used to your revenue being, for the lack of a better word, 20,000 a day. All of a sudden it's cut to 1,000 because a digital subscription is far much cheaper than a physical paper subscription. So in that regard, also just to add on to what Nashilongo was saying, in that regard, the longer term effects of what happened last year and partly this year are still yet to be felt. She spoke about how the newsrooms have become younger, which means less experience, which means the quality of the content becomes poorer, sadly, and which means newspapers and other media houses, even online, they resort to clickbait journalism. There is no investment in investigative journalism. And for that, unfortunately, it's a cycle. You have to release the experienced people and hire younger people who are cheaper, but it means you're going to make less money from your media houses, because the cheaper the material, the less people are going to read it. So there's, I don't want to be pessimistic, Daniel, but we are really in a kind of rut. I think that's why one of the issues at this year's World Press Freedom Day commemorations was media viability, because this is at the center of what is happening with our journalism. What do we do to save it, to keep the experienced people in jobs, to keep media houses, newspapers, online, whatever it be? What do we do to keep them working? Because as it is, even our right to access to information is in trouble with the kind of media house that we have because of what the long-term effects of COVID. So in general, we are in a bit of a spot. I'm not being pessimistic, I'm hopeful, Daniel. But so yeah, we need to come up with solutions to save our media. Just 2 days ago, we had our International Day for Universal Access to Information. One of the recommendations that we made to the government, we also made it last year when COVID was at the beginning, when COVID lockdowns were starting, that, for example, you could reduce import taxes for media equipment, newsprint, recording material. Not to say you are stopping, but just reduce it to give media houses some time to breathe. well, our government, well, they were not supposed to commit at that point, but it's something that we have asked them to do, and try to find ways that they don't necessarily have to give media, they don't need to give us a bailout as the media, but find ways in which they can make our lives slightly more easier.
So the pandemic and these lockdowns have really impacted on the media. Daniel, will the media ever be the same again?
Great. Well, that's a great question. And I want to just pick up on something that the colleague Nakaba from MISA Zimbabwe was just talking about. First of all, yeah, no, it's, I mean, one, that's really great news about the case in Lesotho. I think it just speaks volumes to the power of regional organization. And I think that's one of the things that all of those of us who have kind of studied the situation in Southern Africa are really respectful of the work and power of the MISA network and what it's doing, because maybe, yeah, pessimism is not the right word. I think it's realist. I think that's that's really kind of what you're talking about. But on this, I think it's also important to remember, earlier this year, the World Press Freedom Day was held in Namibia, and it was the 30th anniversary of the Windhoek Declaration. And so there was a Windhoek Plus 30 declaration that came out of that. And one of the things that was actually highlighted in the language was this concern about laws that were created specifically to counter disinformation. And so I think that's, it's opportunities like that to build networks, right? This is actually at a global level, but to use these types of declarations as a way to push governments to not, be the lowest common denominator and have the most repressive policies possible, but try and up the game. One example over the past year that's, I think, related to the same conversation, although slightly different, because it's more around content moderation, is the Nigerian internet shutdown, Twitter shutdown, where the government of Nigeria, after the president's, one of his tweets was deemed to be in conflict with Twitter's policy around, kind of hate speech and violence, and they took that off. Well, ECOWAS, the kind of regional body there, said, you can't really, you can't really hold citizens accountable for using Twitter. That's not proportionate. That's not justifiable in any way. And so that's also another example of where, perhaps regional mechanisms, regional networking, regional advocacy can really play an important role in combating what Admire has said is like policy laundering, right? But governments are just kind of taking one policy from another, put it in. But advocates, we have to do the same thing and think about what are the ways that we can network and marshal our regional resources to, one, show what's not working and show what kind of policies would be bad for these environments, and it's much stronger when you have a solidarity network of people. And this is just one of the things I can just say that's come out of SEMA's research on media development. Some of the best examples of media development improvements emanate from this type of regional cooperation. So I think that's where a lot of the effort should go. And just, I want to applaud again the work that MISA Zimbabwe has been doing on this front for a number of years. In terms of the question, sorry, I got sidetracked about, the media, we don't know the long-term impacts of this. I mean, I think what Nashilongo is talking about, the pushing people into freelance work and the juniorization of it. Freelance work is also much more precarious. You're much more, if one of these laws come down on an individual, it's totally different than if it come down on a media organization, which at least has some perhaps resources or marshal. So, the decentralization of this is a long-term challenge to media.
Thank you, Daniel, for that. I see we are running out of time. Admire. The issue around media availability going onwards. What are your thoughts around that? What can be done to keep the media environment afloat?
Unfortunately, I'm not a soothsayer or a prophet or something like that, but I'll try my best to just map up what I think is likely to happen. Certainly, as Daniel has already pointed out, the space we find ourselves is very fluid. Anything can happen. Some organizations may sink and sink forever, but we are also likely to see some organizations actually remaining afloat. And I think we've seen the resilience of the media system in general, despite the challenges, but the resilience is there for people to see. But I think in terms of the funding, the revenue model, in the business model of this media, we are going to see changes. And I think that we are already beginning to see that. Not-for-profit kind of media startups are beginning to take shape. I think we have seen in Zim, we have also seen in South Africa, platforms like Bekisisa, for example, where you pretty much have to rely more on donors to come and support your work. Otherwise, just relying on the advertising model as we know it, I think it has been disrupted, and it has been disrupted for good with these platform companies. And I don't think there are chances that we may go back to that old normal, if we have to call it the old normal. I don't think we are going to go back there. But I think what we are going to see are various and diverse and hybrid kinds of business models that are going to come to the fore going forward. But again, what we're also going to see is the creativity and innovation of media startups and also even media owners going forward. And also the other fear that I have is media capture, which obviously governments often take advantage of, because when the media becomes very precarious, politicians can always go there as vouchers and take advantage of the media and then own the media, but they own it with specific interests at play. And I think that is my fear, that going forward, I hope our media system is not going to be captured by the elite and also by governments for their own ulterior motives. I think that is my greatest fear going forward. But that's what I would say for now. Thank you.
Yes, that is Admire's greatest fear going forward. Some will remain afloat, some will, sink. So that is the reality of the situation. But we're still monitoring the situation as we go. And then Daniel, in the work that you do in supporting media development, what has been the experience of other regions? We have had experiences of Southern Africa here. I don't know, in the work that we've done, maybe if you could share the media operations in other regions, maybe there are some experiences that you think would be useful for Southern Africa to learn from.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think that'd be helpful. And I can kind of talk about two different, I've already alluded to the power of regional cooperation. And I think the Latin American experience is quite helpful there. They have a really strong kind of intergovernmental bodies, similar to ECOWAS or SADC, but at the Latin American level, that really allow advocates to challenge their governments to raise the level instead of what can happen in a situation where you don't have any of that outward pressure and everyone, it's a race to the bottom, to the most repressive models. And we've seen that in the press freedom space in Latin America. Now, that doesn't mean that I think in general, the situation is challenging around the world. There's no one region that's, it's challenging times for media and for media viability. In terms of that specific question as well, media viability, I think I agree that there is opportunity for innovation and creativity. We're actually working on a research report right now that looks at media outlets in 5 different countries it's actually, I think, a total of like 200 media outlets total in Latin American countries, African countries, and Southeastern Asian countries, to look at what types of these digital natives and how they are able to actually make a profit. And the truth is that there are some outlets that have figured out a way, using hybrid models that are different than traditional media setups, to be sustainable and successful, and using internet platforms to get out high quality information to citizens. So there are paths. I think that in our field, we're still trying to work out what those look like. One of the things that we're really cognizant of and what we want to sharpen our research on is like what's in the different contexts. The digital space creates new challenges in terms of the digital platforms that are largely based in the West and don't have enough resources on the ground to understand the local context, aren't able to necessarily push back as much as we want on some of the policies being implemented. So there are challenges, but I think what we look for is trying to find those situations where things do work and where innovation is happening and it's being successful, and then hopefully try to share that with other people. And stay tuned for that research. It'll be coming out early next year, but I hope that we'll have some positive stories or some positive examples that might shine a light on where we might go and pick up the pieces after this, what's been a really disastrous 2020 and 2021 for media in sub-Saharan Africa, but really globally.
Thank you so much, Daniel. So yes, we are running out of time, and we are wrapping up the conversation right now. And as I will go around all the speakers, so as we close, my question to you is around the way forward. Just respond to the question of what would it take for the media and the public to also function freely beyond the pandemic. And also in the work that you are doing from where you are operating from, is there any work that is being done around engaging governments regarding these laws that we are talking about today, and how bad they are, how they have affected the media, how they have affected freedom of expression and access to information? What do you think should be the approach of engaging the governments with regards to these laws? Because it is very clear that we don't want to see them beyond the pandemic, but what can be done? I will start off with Ngaba.
Very quickly, I'll say what we're doing at least now is to try and engage the government to repeal some sections of these laws. Particularly, the problem is we are being governed by executive orders. It's not via parliament, as we highlighted earlier. So what we're working on is try to engage government so that we come up with a timeline or a roadmap of what it's going to take for us to repeal these regulations and to see how we can work together. We are in the process of writing a model law in terms of how best government could have handled this. I don't know if they're going to accept it, but at least we're going to put something on the table.
Thank you, Naba. Nashilongo. Muted, Nashilongo, your parting words around the way forward, engaging governments with regards to these laws, and also responding to the question of what it will take for the media to function freely beyond the pandemic.
Thank you, Hlengiwe. I think this, from the colleagues' contribution, there seems to be a call on collaboration and asking government on those timelines on what's going to happen beyond COVID to these laws. From a researcher point of view, I would be interested to keep a tab on to what's happening on the region in terms of whether these laws stays in place or whether they get turned into something else. Really just trying to monitor what would be the different governments' steps or actions regarding these laws will be. You had a second question, and I think that spoke to what will happen in the beyond this, right?
Yes, what it will take for the media and the public to function freely beyond the pandemic.
Yeah, I think those suggestions that came out seemed to make more sense now. I think, for instance, what Admaya is saying, that really a hybrid mean of media operations that doesn't rely heavily on advertisers, because the advertisers anyway have been taken away by platforms, at least at this certain state, and that more the media becomes more liberalized, hopefully, because of these many innovations that we most likely to see going forward. It would be very interesting, I think, for a lot of the academics and the researchers. It would be very interesting to hear what they report going forward in terms of the media recovery process beyond COVID. in terms of even the funding model or the operation model? Or will it remain? How many media houses will be closing? How many journalists leaves their jobs? And what sort of areas do they find themselves in? So many areas of research that I think everybody should be looking out for. And personally, I will also be looking out to undertake or to monitor or to look at. Yeah, thank you.
Admire, your parting words. How should we be engaging governments with regards to these regulations and these repressive laws?
Yes, so in terms of engaging the governments, again, there are no maybe quick fixes in terms of really how to do it. Of course, it depends with the context, but I would say that going forward, obviously, we need to probably, as much as possible, work with our members of parliament to knock sense in them that really these repressive legislations don't really work in our favor. But also, I think there's also maybe room for strategic litigation going forward around some of these things, because they were also done outside of, consultations. So I think there are many opportunities that are there that can actually be harnessed before we can maybe go to town and cry about what's happening. But let's see how it goes. I would also stand again by the issue that collaborations going forward are key. Regional campaigns are around this, because not only one country is being affected. I think almost every other country has its own kinds of peculiar problems that they are dealing with going forward. With that, I think I'm done. Thank you so much.
Daniel, your parting words.
Great, thanks. Well, I think that regional cooperation, solidarity are really important. I would just want to thank the organizers of this panel. I want to thank actually CPEZA as well, because the Forum on Internet Freedom for Africa is a really important mechanism for doing that. I mean, I've learned so much on this call. And so I just want to thank the other panelists and the attendees too for being here. This is one of the vehicles that we can kind of do that. And I just think that that is kind of the only path forward. We got to keep moving and keep improving. I remember Nashilongo and I were on a panel, I think it was maybe 3 years ago, on misinformation. Isn't it incredible how kind of the situation has changed? It was kind of at that time, this threat, we didn't really know how to do it. And now we have these concrete laws, especially with COVID. What people have said is it gave governments an excuse to implement these things. And so we're in a completely different position. It means the research questions and the advocacy questions that we have are different. It's really important for us to connect, to sharpen those and to share experiences. And I think if we do that, good things will happen.
Good things will happen. We remain hopeful. Thank you very much to our speakers, Brian O'Malley, Nashilongo, Admire, and Ngaba Machazi. This was a very exciting session. So I just want to also extend our sincere gratitude to CPEZA for organizing this very insightful event. We have had the opportunity to deliberate. There have been several other sessions that have been very informative, and we continue. Rights are claimed. We'll continue claiming the rights. We'll continue using this space. And also, we would also like to thank our sign language interpretation. We really appreciate you. We are pushing the agenda of digital inclusion on the continent, and by having sign language interpretation, this is one of the ways. I think on that note, we end this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us.
Cheers.
Oh yeah, quickly, let me just take a photo. I see somebody left already. Oh, okay, we are all on. Hold on. Done. Thank you.